All right, hi, I'm Scott Roth. I teach the World War II course. Want to start with the rise of fascism today. This will be the first essay for us. It's quite a lengthy one, but it's important to understand. So I want to start with who started this. That would be Benito Mussolini, Il Duce. The goals of Mussolini and many Italians at the time was to stop the spread of communism inside Italy. There was disappointment over Versailles, which you read about. The Italians felt that their spoils were denied to them, that the work they did had not come to fruition, so there is some bitterness over Versailles. One thing I try to show in class too is the fasces, the Fasces, which was the symbol of Roman power that Mussolini took from the distant past. He very much focused on nationalism and on history, just as Hitler would, but we'll get to him in a minute. For Mussolini and others, there was the fear of the Red Spectre in Italy. Rightist elements in Italy had formed their own fighting squads to oppose the left, and specifically communism. Mussolini was leader of one of these squads. Now, at a fascist party conference in October of 22, Mussolini declared, quote, "Either the government will be given to us or we shall seize it by marching on Rome." This led to the March on Rome in October of 1922. Mussolini hatches a plan to occupy public buildings in the major cities in North and Central Europe, and after establishing power in these public buildings, he and his black shirts would march to Rome and demand the resignation of, and thus the takeover of, the Italian government. What's the problem with this plan? Well, there are a handful. The Italian army, first of all, greatly outnumbered the fascist party or any military group it could organize. Technologically, the fascists were limited. They did not enjoy the weaponry that the Italian army did. Many of these inexperienced fighters simply brought farm tools from home to conduct their operation. That's where you get the fasces as well. Initially, the effort appeared to be working. Mussolini and his supporters occupied these buildings, but martial law would be declared by the prime minister, Facta, and the Italian army was set up to crush the uprising. But wait, King Victor Emmanuel III was not certain of his army's loyalty. Would it be to him? Would it be to the government in general? Would it be to side with the increasingly popular Mussolini and his fascists? Thus, Facta was forced to resign. The king feared the conflict that this march might create and wanted to avoid a civil war. He also feared his cousin, who was the Duke of Acosta, might replace him if the king stood up to Mussolini and failed. The Duke was a fascist supporter. Mussolini thereby would not march on Rome. He would arrive in the city by train, as would his black shirts. And upon arrival, he is made the prime minister by a weak and scared king. A ceremonial parade would be held on October 31st, 1922. One commentator stated, quote, "The Marx brothers could not have bettered the whole affair." Mussolini takes power, and his fascism again derives from a sense of totalitarianism, which means the supremacy of the all-powerful state. Mussolini glorified courage, he glorified force, and he glorified war. He would focus on developing the Navy and the Air Force to maintain this fascist control. Now, I mentioned history. Mussolini wants to go back. One of his main goals is to rule the Mediterranean, just as the Roman Empire had. Currently, France was in North Africa. Britain was in Africa as well. Italy wanted to get them out. Now, his rise came prior to that of Hitler, and Hitler actually became a great admirer of Mussolini, particularly his March on Rome. He would provide some financial support to the rising Nazi party in Germany and allowed SA and SS men to train with his own paramilitary brigade, the Black Shirts. When Hitler rose to power, Mussolini praised this and hailed it as a victory for fascist ideology. Privately, though, he was scornful of Hitler. He called Mein Kampf boring. He called his theories coarse and simplistic. He considered Hitler's rise to power less glorious than his own. And we will get to Hitler's rise to power in a few minutes. The Venice summit in June of 1934 between the two left each of them thinking a little less of the other. As one can imagine, two egos of that size clashing in one room. Mussolini, like Hitler, believed white Europeans to be the architects of civilization and culture, but he did not extend this to a rabid anti-Semitism that we associate with Hitler. He emphasized nationalism, particularly the triumphs of ancient Rome, and while he did form an alliance with Germany, his main goals still revolved around Italy and its own gains. Now, in 1938, July of 1938, Mussolini would issue his Manifesto of Race, which stripped Italian Jews of citizenship and removed them from government occupations. This was obviously influenced by Hitler's rising power and the fact Mussolini needed Hitler. Why would he need Hitler? Because he made some erroneous decisions. For example, the Italian invasion of what we know as Ethiopia. Italy invaded Abyssinia, or Ethiopia, the only African country not yet under European control, in an attempt to begin rebuilding an Italian empire to replicate glories of ancient Rome, with a focus on the Mediterranean and Africa. No defense is put up. The League of Nations actually asked to restrict trade with Italy, but this had no effect. The League was quite critical of the move, but Hitler, who had pulled Germany out of the League in 1933, backed Mussolini. Appeasement is offered again here. The British people rejected any type of idea of going into Africa to fight Italy. And when the League of Nations tried sanctions, this drove Mussolini closer to Hitler. And again, the League of Nations would be quite weak in the face of this action. Now let's get to Hitler and his rise. Now, we all go back to the Treaty of Versailles, right? The Germans are humiliated, they are blamed for the war, they are taxed with major reparations, which of course they don't pay. And some historians argue that they absolutely could have paid them, but they refused to. Now, part of Hitler's rise, of course, is connected to Versailles, but there's a lot more to this. And again, some historians, without getting into the details, will argue that Hitler was just a traditional European leader who took more extreme actions, if you will, and that his rise was inevitable regardless of Versailles. And when we look at the issues between the wars, for example, the Great Depression, which hits the United States, hits Europe as well, this leads to increasing isolationism among European nations. But again, this is a major factor in what will lead to Hitler's rise, or these economic problems, and his promises to rectify them. And he actually would rectify a few of them at the expense of other parts of the economy, of course. Versailles, again, is part of the problem. And another issue is Hitler's hatred of communism. Now, some might say, oh, you know, they kind of put Nazis and communists in the same bucket, which is absolutely incorrect. Hitler hated communists. And one of the things that we'll get to later, one of the reasons that we see appeasement is because of the West's desire for Hitler to stave off communist aggression. They thought, well, we've got Germany to the east of us, and they can block any aggression by the Soviet Communist Empire. Now let's get into more of the details of the rise of Hitler. How was he able to garner so much power? Part of this is timing, the post-war issues, the depression, anger, disillusionment. Of course, propaganda plays a part. Connected to this somewhat is terror and brutality, and of course, some good old-fashioned charisma. Some things that we also connect with this era would be nationalism, the rise of nationalism, the rise of anti-communism, and of course, we will get to anti-Semitism. The fall 1930 elections, called by Chancellor Brüning to provide a mandate. This would be a miscalculation. We're going to get to this here in a little bit, but basically the Nazi Party came into power via the vote. Now, the Nazis, what does Nazi stand for? National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, this is what creates some of the confusion. Socialist is in there, right? Well, this isn't about a Marxist socialism. This is about subjugation to the nation, subjugation to the state, or the term Gleichschaltung, which was Hitler's main focus. And what he said was everything is for the sake of the state. Subjugation to the state, integration into the state, a total merger. Again, Hitler named this Gleichschaltung. Part of this, I should say kind of the ideological foundation of this, was the belief that Judeo-Christian values of charity, meekness, and international brotherhood weakened the state. I guess he was reading a little bit of Gibbon and his ideas on the fall of the Roman Empire. And of course, part of this, and this leads to part of his disdain for Jews, would be his belief that Germany surrendered at the end of World War I due to Jewish treachery at home. Again, we're going to get to that in a little bit, but basically, Hitler and other Germans really at the time believed that Germany could still win World War I, whereas German Jews were very much behind the peace movement. And according to Hitler and some others, of course, these Jews are what forced Germany to surrender, to humiliate itself, thereby leading to a sense of historical hatred for Hitler and others toward this. So let's move back a little bit. I mentioned the 1930 elections, but we're going to go back to 1923, the Beer Hall Putsch, which you have probably heard of, a coup, an attempt to overthrow the government. This was an attempt by the Nazis to overthrow the German government, create a unified Greater German Reich where citizenship would be based upon race. This is inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome. This would be Hitler's March on Berlin. The goals were to smash the opposition, establish a dictatorial state with citizenship restricted to Nordic stock, exclude Jews from political life, and pass emergency legislation that would allow, quote, the removal of all persons dangerous to security and useless eaters, end quote, to concentration camps where they could be productive with their labor. Now, really, the final solution does not take clarity for, well, till 1940 or 1941. But what's interesting here, this term useless eaters. This is a term that Hitler comes up with for those he considers less than human. Jews, obviously, would be one. Any Africans would fall into that. Disabled people, homosexuals, these are all groups that Hitler wanted to extinguish. These were what he called useless eaters. The party was about 50,000 members strong at the time, many of whom wanted to take action against the Democratic Republic. Included in this group were Goering, Himmler, Rudolf Hess, and Wilhelm Frick. The radical and Völkisch nationalist coalition had united in formation of what was called the Kampfbund, or the Combat League. I may have mispronounced that, I apologize. This included the Nazis. Meanwhile, members of the government itself also sought to end the Republican experiment. They would meet to discuss overthrow as well, and the meeting was crashed by Hitler and his League. So you already have a group that's seeking to overthrow the Republic, and Hitler and his group come in to crash the party. But mistakes are made. The conspirators failed to take over some of the key offices, including police headquarters. If you want to start a revolution or overthrow the government, you need the police and you need the military. That's a little foreshadowing. Little control over government leaders, and when they were left alone, they called on police forces and troops for assistance. It was flat out disorganized. Notably, after finding out about the betrayal of the three government leaders he had thought supported him, Hitler stalled before leading his march to Berlin. Indecision gave time to Bavarian authorities to defend Munich, and they would be defeated. Now, this would fail, obviously, but it was good for a few reasons for Hitler. First of all, for propaganda reasons. This was an attempt to save the nation, according to Hitler and his cronies. Hitler learned again he needed the support of the military and the police, but more importantly, he recognized he would need to take advantage of the democracy to subvert the state from within. Thereby, he wants to change the system from within. This is kind of the danger of a democratic republic or a democracy, that a group can come in, get voted in, and then change the entire system. Now, the party would be banned. The ban would be lifted in 1925 when Hitler would restructure the party, and after the Nazis came to power, he would establish November 9th as the Reich Day of Mourning. As for Hitler at the trial after this putsch, he claimed the federal government had betrayed Germany by signing Versailles, and he claimed there was an imminent threat of communism to Germany. 1932 would be an important year for the Nazis. German presidential election would be held. This was the third under the Weimar Constitution. This would be held in March, then in April. Paul von Hindenburg was the incumbent. He would go against Hitler and Ernst Thälmann, who was a communist. Hindenburg wanted to end his presidency after his second term, which began in 1925, but he kept his name on the ballot to prevent Hitler from winning. In April of 32, the Nazis would increase their representation in the Prussian Landtag from 9 to 162 seats, making them the largest party in the body. and Prussia represented nearly 62% of the land area of Weimar Germany, so this was quite significant. In July, the German Reichstag election, after von Papen had been appointed chancellor and the Reichstag dissolved in June, the Nazis would win 230 seats, which was 37% of the total, the largest in the Reichstag. The communists, for example, had 100 seats at this time. Von Papen thought Hitler would side with him, but with this strength, he declared he would not join a coalition government. And why? If your party is most members in the Reichstag, why would you form a coalition? In September, a no-confidence vote in von Papen government is declared, and Hindenburg would dissolve the newly seated Reichstag one more time. In the crucial election in November of 1932, the 84-year-old Hindenburg inadvertently helped Hitler to the position of chancellor. Franz von Papen, P-A-P-E-N, was one of Hindenburg's most trusted underlings, convinced him that in a multi-party cabinet with the Nazis as a distinct minority, he could control Hitler as chancellor. So January 30th, 1933, Hitler is appointed chancellor. Hitler, though, would outflank the opposition in the cabinet. He succeeded in having Hindenburg approve a series of Article 48 measures, which essentially ended civil liberty in the Republic of Germany. The Nazis won 32% of the seats in this election. Hitler's cabinet issued a decree for the protection of the German people on February 4th, 1933. This included constraints on the press, and it authorized the police to ban political meetings and marches. February 27th, 1933, the German parliament, or Reichstag, is burned to the ground due to arson. The government would claim it was done by communists who were attempting to overthrow the state. Hitler would take this opportunity and this gaslighting, if you will, to permanently suspend civil rights and render the protection of the German people decree, once temporary, as now permanent. Convinced that this was started by communists, Hindenburg himself approved of the decree for the protection of the people and the state, also known as the Reichstag Fire Decree. Again, this would be declared officially on the 28th of February. This further suspended the right to assembly. It suspended the right to free speech. It suspended the right to a free press. The regime was allowed to arrest and incarcerate political opponents without any charges. It dissolved political organizations. It suppressed publications. It gave central government the authority to overrule state and local laws and overthrow state and local governments. It suspended all restraints on police investigations. The press would describe Hitler's action as saving the nation from Bolshevism, and his popularity grows. March 23rd of 1933, Hindenburg signed the Enabling Bill, which gave Hitler dictatorial power, quote, for protection of people and state. Now Hitler could make laws without consulting the Reichstag. Moderates preferred radical extremism of Nazis to the revolutionary extremism of communists. So you have Nazis versus communists, and even those who are not Nazis are more concerned with the communists, so they will not necessarily support the Nazis, but not fight against them. Trade unions are destroyed, civil service and the bar are purged of Jews, and in July, political parties are banned. President Hindenburg would eventually die in August of 1934, and the offices of Chancellor and President would be merged, you got it, under Hitler's leadership. August 19th of 1934, Hitler would declare himself Führer, or leader of the German Reich. Now we have a few other things to get to before we kind of finalize this part. For example, the Night of the Long Knives, also known as Operation Hummingbird, the Rome Putsch of June 29th, 1934 through July 2nd. So it's a 4-day period. Why the violence? This gets into another one of the rivalries within the Nazi Party. Rome was in charge, ROHM, was in charge of the SA, or the stormtroopers, the brown shirts. This was a substantial army of 2 million men used as an enforcer of the party's dictates. Now, Rome was a loyal Nazi. He was loyal to Hitler since his rise, and his growing popular rendered others jealous. What others? Himmler and Goering, two guys you don't want to have a problem with you. Himmler and Goering would convince Hitler that Rome was planning to try and overthrow Hitler. He in turn wanted to get rid of potential rivals, of course, and knew he needed the support of the army leadership, who he felt looked down on him because he had barely been a corporal. The army also viewed the SA as a threat to their authority, as they were outnumbered by the SA by 1934, and Rome had hinted that the SA would absorb the army into its ranks. Hitler made a pact. If Rome and other SA leaders were removed, the rank-and-file SA men could come under the control of the army as long as the army swore an oath of loyalty to Hitler. The army agreed. On the evening of June 29th, into the morning of the 30th, SS units, or the black shirts, or nothing to do with Nebraska football, arrested leaders of the SA and other political opponents and carried on the next 2 nights. 77 men would be executed on charges of treason, though the number is likely quite higher. Rome was shot and others were bludgeoned to death. The SA was placed under the command of the army. Hitler received his oath of allegiance from the army, and everything seemed peachy for Hitler and his Nazis. Significantly, this represents when Hitler declared he no longer needed the courts, that he was the supreme judge as Führer. And we know this mindset would dominate Germany throughout the remainder of his rule. The SS, for its part, would become the most feared force in Germany and only strengthen the power of Himmler. The SS would assume control of the centralized police force and a centralized concentration camp system eventually. By 1937, all police forces were under the direction of Himmler and his SS. The Daily Mail on July 2nd, 1934, at the end of this, would say, quote, Adolf Hitler, the German chancellor, has saved his country. Swiftly and with inexorable severity, he has delivered Germany from men who would have become a danger to the unity of the German people and to the order of the state. With lightning rapidity, he has caused them to be removed from high office, to be arrested and put to death. The names of the men who have been shot by his orders are already known. Hitler's love of Germany has triumphed over private friendships and fidelity to comrades who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the fight for Germany's future. Yes, Hitler has control of the press by this point. Now, from 33 to 36, in general, we see increased economic prosperity in Germany. The military is expanded. Economic policy of deficit budgeting, putting money in public works and industry. So Hitler is really reaching out. The people are suffering, and he is making it look like, hey, I'm working for you, right? Now, there are 2 video lectures on appeasement, which will get more into this. For example, his expansion of the military, his creation of a navy during a time when he was legally and theoretically forbidden to do such. That's, again, in the appeasement videos, which I believe are in week 3, maybe week 2, actually. Now, important to note the Nuremberg laws, which were issued September 15th, 1935. Hitler claims, quote, legal regulation of the problem of Jews in Germany was the only way to, quote, stop the defensive actions of the enraged population. Now, you can look at the verbiage he uses here, defensive actions, enraged population. He would define what a Jew was. If one had 3 or more grandparents, they were Jewish. If they had 2, they were considered half Jew. If they were married to one or part of a community, they were treated as a full Jew. If they were baptized Christian, they were able to keep their citizenship initially. This would eventually go away. What did the Nuremberg laws do? First of all, they took away German citizenship from all full Jews and half Jews. 2, they prohibited Jews from flying the German flag. Eventually, Germans married to Jews were also prohibited from doing this. It prohibited sexual relations between Aryans and Jews. And the last thing, it prohibited marriage between Aryans and Jews. Now, getting back again, why does Hitler hate Jews so much? Part of it stems from World War I, the end of World War I. He blamed the Jews for leading German surrender. Of course, he also connects Jews to communism. Some of the Bolshevik leaders were originally Jewish. Of course, Marxists do not believe in religion. It is the opiate of the masses, according to Marx. So the true Bolsheviks were not religious at all. So considering Trotsky and Kamenev as Jews and thereby they're the problem is, again, somewhat faulty reasoning. This is kind of Hitler's, one of his main claims to fame, though, his faulty reasoning. So again, World War I, the ties to Bolshevism. He did believe connected to this international conspiracy to take over the world. So there are a few things that kind of guide this sentiment. Now, I mentioned the military buildup, how this goes against Versailles, a couple things. 1934, Hitler will reintroduce conscription, which is the draft, making people go to the military. And in the same year, he begins his buildup of the Navy. This is part of the larger British policy of appeasement, which again, you'll get to in those lectures on appeasement. Now, a couple more things. I want to mention the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht. This was November 9th, 1938. Now, 2 days prior, German junior diplomat, it's spelled Ernst, it's Ernst, von Roth, no relation, was killed by a 17-year-old Polish Jewish refugee whose parents had been deported from Germany to Poland. This set off what was known as the Night of Broken Glass. This was a coordinated terror attempt throughout Germany and Austria. Synagogues were burned, Jewish homes were destroyed, Jewish shops were ransacked, hundreds of Jews were killed, tens of thousands were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The rest of the world would be repulsed by these actions. As for Neville Chamberlain, the man with the umbrella, he still felt he could secure peace. He didn't understand the widespread criticism. Now, there are different historical analyses available of Chamberlain. Some don't think he was that bad. He very much was behind the policy of appeasement. And again, when you get to the appeasement lecture on Munich, some of the things that Hitler has to say about him, let's just say they're not nice. Now, I want to finish up with Andres Hilgruber, who is a noted historian on Germany, and his main work, Germany and the Two World Wars. And this is consensus history. Hilgruber talks about Hitler's grand solution. This is not the final solution, but the grand solution included global Anglo-German compromise, with England remaining neutral while Germany consolidated power in Europe. Germany would guarantee the British Empire as England sat by. Now, this is also one of the reasons some believe that Hitler will stall his attack when in France because he was trying to get the British to come to his side. And this is something Hitler believed because of the historic connection, the Aryan connection, the Anglo-Saxon connection between Germany and England, that England and the English and the Germans were one and the same. And that eventually the English would just remain neutral while Germany did what it wanted in Europe, because Germany would guarantee the British Empire to remain. And Hitler actually thought that this would work, that he could just get the English, get on board with him, and nobody else would be a problem. Of course, spoiler alert, that doesn't happen. According to Hilgruber, there were two stages of Hitler's plan. First, he would consolidate continental power in Europe, first through peaceful means, again, Munich, then through localized wars. Then he would add a colonial realm in North Africa and develop his navy. This would create four powers, eventually leading Germany to fight against the United States, which was the main world power in his estimation. Now, a few things that are part of his final solution. First of all, he holds Russia in low esteem. Slavs, Russians, all Slavs he considers to be inferior. He also believed in a qualitative military. Now and this is what you're going to see throughout the war, not just with Nazi Germany, but with Japan as well, there is a desire to prevent or to avoid a long war with these powers, but go one by one with short, quick surprise attacks with his blitzkrieg, for example. So if he focuses on quality, short surprise attacks with a high quality military, then he won't need to fight a war of attrition, which he knows that he will lose. Again, anti-Semitism is intricately tied to these overall goals. First, he must exterminate the Jewish leadership of Bolsheviks in Germany, then in Russia, or the Soviet Union, and thus bring down the Soviet Union. He believed the defeat of Jews in Russia or the Soviet Union were inseparable. After doing this, he would exploit the former Soviet territories as colonies for economic gain. His goal was to transform the European continent along racial lines. He would begin his eastern push, of course, in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, which we'll get to in a few weeks. Now, Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Bolsheviks are not just automatically Jewish, right? And Marxists don't follow religion, so that was kind of ridiculous. Another part of his final solution here, or grand solution, I apologize, would be the goal of economic independence. He did not want to become dependent on any other nations. Thus, he wanted to keep Germany out of the world economy. And with expansion and taking over the resources and the lands of these other areas, he could only, of course, expand this economic independence. And of course, a last part of this, which I've not gotten to yet, is Lebensraum, or the idea that he needed living space for the German Empire. This is another similarity that we will see with Japan. Now, Hitler, again, kind of finishing up Hillgruber's analysis, Hitler relied on other nations battling each other to gain hegemony. England sought a balance of power. They feared the French gaining too much. He was, and they would be, this again gets to the appeasement angle, they were willing to allow Germany some flexibility, if you will, to help keep the communists down. So again, Hitler is set up somewhat as a wall of separation from the communists. And this is, part of my larger thoughts on the 20th century are the stance on anti-communism hurt us in so many ways. We may have won the Cold War, but this is an example of if we are not so stringently anti-communist in the 1930s, does Hitler expand the way he does? Of course, this will set the stage for Hitler's actions during the war, and World War II would be about to begin. Now, it is incumbent upon me to mention the other major fascist country in Europe. That would, of course, be Spain. The Spanish Civil War was fought 1936 through 1939. Fascists versus communists, nationalists versus Republicans. Germany and Italy would help the nationalists, the fascists. The Soviets would help the Republicans, or the communists. The international brigades were peopled by radicals and communists from everywhere in the world, including our own Ernest Hemingway from the United States. Many other writers at the time would work in the ambulance services for Spain during this war. But this is interesting because you have this little war within the larger war in Spain, and there's the Spanish Civil War. Later, of course, we will also see this, well, actually, even up to this time, but we'll focus more on it when we get to the Chinese Civil War, which is another war within World War II. All right, next, please make sure to watch the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which provides the same information on the rise of the Japanese Empire.